Last time we spoke about the climax of the Battle of Lake Hassan. In August, the Lake Hassan region became a tense theater of combat as Soviet and Japanese forces clashed around Trangkufang and Hill 52. The Soviets pushed a multi-front offensive, bolstered by artillery, tanks, and air power, yet the Japanese defenders held firm, aided by engineers, machine guns, and heavy guns. By the 9th and 10th, a stubborn Japanese resilience kept Hill 52 and Trangkufang in Japanese hands, though the price was steep, and the field was littered with the costs of battle. Diplomatically, both sides aimed to confine the fighting and avoid a larger war. Negotiations trudged on, culminating in a tentative ceasefire draft for August the 11th. A halt to hostilities, positions to be held as of midnight on the 10th, and the creation of a border demarcation commission. Moscow pressed for a neutral umpire. Tokyo resisted, accepting a Japanese participant but rejecting a neutral referee. The ceasefire was imperfect, with miscommunications and differing interpretations persisting. This episode is Operation Hainan. Well, hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so we'll give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to produce its content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube. Or you can check out my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, I just covered a mini-series looking at the Battle of the Atlantic. And if you're looking to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, you get early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. After what seemed like a lifetime over in the northern border between the USSR and Japan, today we are finally returning back to the Second Sino-Japanese War. Now, I thought it might be a bit jarring to dive right into it, so let me do a brief summary of where we are at in the year of 1939. As the calendar turned to 1939, the Second Sino-Japanese War, which had erupted in July of 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, had escalated into a full-scale conflict. This had evolved into a protracted quagmire for the Empire of Japan. What began as a swift campaign to subjugate the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek had, by the close of 1938, transformed into a war of attrition. Japanese forces under the command of generals like Shinuko Hata or Yasuje Okamura had achieved stunning territorial gains. The fall of Shanghai in November of 1937, after a brutal 3-month battle that cost over 200,000 Chinese lives. The infamous capture of Nanjing in December of 1937, marked by the Nanjing massacre, where an estimated 300,000 civilians and disarmed soldiers were killed in a 6-week orgy of violence. And the sequential occupations of Suzhou in May of 1938, Wuhan in October of 1938, and Guangzhou that same month. These victories secured Japan's control over China's eastern seaboard. Major riverine arteries like the Yangtze and key industrial centers, effectively stripping the nationalists of much of their economic base. Yet, despite these advances, China refused to capitulate. Chiang Kai-shek's government had retreated inland to the mountainous stronghold of Chongqing in Sichuan province, where it regrouped amidst the fog-laden gorges, drawing on the vast human reserves of China's interior and the resilient spirit of its people. By late 1938, Japanese casualties had mounted to approximately 50,000 killed and 200,000 wounded annually, straining the Imperial Japanese Army's resources and exposing the vulnerabilities of overextended supply lines deep into hostile territory. In Tokyo, the corridors of the Imperial General Headquarters and the Army Ministry buzzed with urgent deliberations during the winter of 1938 to 1939. The initial doctrine of a quick victory through decisive battle, epitomized by massive offensives of 1937 and 1938, had proven to be illusions. Japan's military planners, influenced by the Kwangtung Army's experiences in Manchuria and the ongoing stalemate, recognized that China's sheer size, with its 4 million square miles and over 400 million inhabitants, rendered total conquest unfeasible without unacceptable costs. Intelligence reports highlighted the persistence of Chinese guerrilla warfare, particularly in the north, where communist forces under Mao Zedong's 8th Route Army conducted hit-and-run operations from bases in Shanxi and Shaanxi, sabotaging railways and ambushing convoys. The Japanese response included brutal pacification campaigns, such as the earlier iterations of what would later become formalized as the Three Alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all, aimed at devastating rural economies and isolating resistance pockets. But these measures only fueled further defiance. By early 1939, a strategic pivot was formalized, away from direct annihilation of Chinese armies towards a policy of economic strangulation. This blockade and interdiction approach sought to sever China's lifelines to external aid, choking off the flow of weapons, fuel, and material that sustained the nationalist war effort. As one Japanese staff officer noted in his internal memos, the goal was to, quote, starve the dragon in its lair. Acknowledging the limits of Japanese manpower, total forces in China numbered around 1 million by 1939, against China's inexhaustible reserves. Central to this new strategy were the three primary overland supply corridors that had emerged as China's backdoors to the world, compensating for the Japanese naval blockade that had sealed off most coastal ports since 1937. The first and most iconic was, of course, the Burma Road, a 717-mile engineering marvel hastily constructed between 1937 and 1938 by over 200,000 Chinese and Burmese laborers under the direction of engineers like Chi Ping-chen. Stretching from the railway head at Lasio in British-held Burma, that's modern-day Myanmar, through treacherous mountain passes and dense jungles to Kunming in Yunnan province, the road navigated elevations up to 7,000 feet, with hundreds of hairpin turns and precarious bridges. By early 1939, it was operational, albeit plagued by monsoon mudslides, banditry, and mechanical breakdowns of the imported trucks, many being Ford and Chevrolet models supplied by British Dragoon. Despite these challenges, it funneled an averaging volume of aid. In 1939 alone, estimates suggest up to 10,000 tons per month of munitions, gasoline, and aircraft parts from Allied sources, including early Lend-Lease precursors from the United States. The road's completion in 1938 had been a direct response to the loss of the southern ports, and its vulnerability to aerial interdiction made it a prime target for Japanese planning documents. The second lifeline was the Indochina route, centered on the French-built Yunnan-Vietnam Railway, also known as the Hanoi-Kunming Railway, a 465-mile narrow-gauge line completed in 1910 that linked the port of Haiphong in French Indochina to Kunming via Hanoi and Lao Cai. This colonial artery, supplemented by parallel roads and river transport along the Red River, became China's most efficient supply conduit in 1938 to 1939, exploiting France's uneasy neutrality. French authorities, under Governor-General Pierre Pasquier and later Georges Catroux, turned a blind eye to the transshipments, allowing an average of 15,000 to 20,000 tons monthly in early 1939, far surpassing the Burma Road's initial capacity. Cargoes included Soviet arms rerouted via Vladivostok and American oil, with French complicity driven by anti-Japanese sentiment and profitable tolls. However, Japanese reconnaissance flights from bases in Guangdong noted the vulnerability of bridges and railway yards, leading to initial bombing raids by mid-1939. Diplomatic pressure mounted, with Tokyo issuing protests to Paris, foreshadowing the 1940 closure under Vichy France after the fall of France in Europe. The route's proximity to the South China Sea made it a focal point for Japanese naval strategists, who viewed it as a leak in the blockade. The third corridor, often overlooked but critical, was the Northwest Highway through Soviet Central Asia and Xinjiang Province. This overland network, upgraded between 1937 and 1941 with Soviet assistance, connected the Turkestan-Siberian Railway at Almaty to Lanzhou and Guangzhou via Urumqi, utilizing a mix of trucks, camel caravans, and rudimentary roads across the Gobi Desert and the Tanshan Mountains. Under the Sino-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of August 1937 and subsequent aid agreements, Moscow supplied China with over 900 aircraft, 82 tanks, 1,300 artillery pieces, and vast quantities of ammunition and fuel between 1937 and 1941, much of it traversing this route. By 1939, volumes peaked, with Soviet pilots and advisors even establishing air bases in Nanjing. The highway's construction involved tens of thousands of Chinese laborers, facing harsh winters and logistical hurdles, but it delivered up to 2,000 tons monthly, including entire fighter squadrons like the Polikarpov I-16. Japanese intelligence, aware of this red lifeline, planned disruptions but were constrained by the ongoing Namahan incident on the Manchurian-Soviet border in 1939, which would divert resources and highlight the risks of provoking Moscow. These routes collectively sustained China's resistance, prompting Japan's high command to prioritize their severance. In March of 1939, the South China Area Army was established under General Rikichi Ando, later succeeded by Field Marshal Hisaichi Terachi, and they'd be headquartered in Guangzhou with explicit orders to disrupt southern communications. Aerial campaigns intensified with Mitsubishi G3M Nell bombers targeting Kunming's airfields and the Red River's bridges, while diplomatic maneuvers pressured colonial powers. Britain faced demands during June of 1939, known as the Tianjin Crisis, to close the Burma Road, and France received ultimatums that culminated in the 1940 occupation of North Indochina. Yet direct assaults on Yunnan or Guangxi were deemed too arduous due to rugged terrain and disease risks. Instead, planners eyed peripheral objectives to encircle these arteries. This strategic calculus set the stage for the invasion of Hainan Island, a 13,000-square-mile landmass off Guangdong's southern coast, rich in iron and copper but strategically priceless for its position astride the Indochina route and proximity to Hong Kong. By February of 1939, Japanese admirals like Nobutake Kondo of the Fifth Fleet advocated seizure to establish air naval bases, plugging blockade gaps and enabling raids on Haiphong and Kunming, a prelude to a broader southern expansion that would echo into the Pacific War. Now, after the fall campaign around Canton in autumn of 1938, the Japanese 21st Army found itself embedded in a relentless effort to sever the enemy's lifelines. Its primary objective shifted from mere battlefield engagements to tightening the choke points of enemy supply, especially along the Canton-Haikou Railway. Recognizing that war material continued to flow into the enemy's hands, the Imperial General Headquarters ordered the 21st Army to strike at every other supply route, one by one, until the arteries of logistics were stifled. The 21st Army undertook a series of decisive occupations to disrupt transport and provisioning from multiple directions. To sustain these difficult campaigns, Imperial General Headquarters reinforced the South China Command, enabling greater operational depth and endurance. The 21st Army benefited from a series of reinforcements during 1939, which allowed a reorganization of assignments and missions. In late January, the Ida Detachment was reorganized into the Formosa Mixed Brigade and took part in the invasion of Hainan Island. Hainan, just 15 miles across the Guangzhou Strait from the mainland, represented a critical loophole. It lay astride the Gulf of Tonkin, enabling smuggling of arms and material from Haiphong to Kunming, and offered potential airfields for bombing raids deep into Yunnan province. Japanese interest in Hainan dated back to the 1920s, driven by the Taiwan Governor General's Office, which eyed the island's tropical resources, such as rubber, iron, and copper, as well as the potential naval ports at places like Sanya. Pre-war surveys by Japanese firms, such as those documented in Idekiwada's Minami Shinya no Sangyo to Keisai, written in 1939, highlighted mineral wealth and strategic harbors. The fall of Guangzhou in October of 1938 provided the perfect launchpad, but direct invasion was delayed until early 1939 amid some debates between the IGA and the IGN, who were prioritizing simply different things. The operation would also heavily align with the broader southward advance, or Nanshinran Doctrine, foreshadowing the soon-to-be invasion of French Indochina. Now on the Chinese side, Hainan was lightly defended as part of Guangdong's peace preservation, under General Yu Hanmo. 2 security regiments, 6 guard battalions, and a self-defense corps, totaling around 7,000 to 10,000 poorly equipped troops guarded the island, supplemented by roughly 300 communist guerrillas under Feng Baiji, who operated independently in the interior. The indigenous Li people in the mountainous south, alienated by nationalist taxes, provided uneven support, but would later ally with the communists. The Imperial General Headquarters ordered the 21st Army, in cooperation with the Navy, to occupy and hold strategic points on the island near Haikou. The 21st Army commander assigned the Formosa Mixed Brigade to carry out the mission. Planning began in late 1938 under the IJN's Fifth Fleet, with IJ support. The objective was to secure the northern and southern landing sites to bisect the island, establish air and naval bases, and exploit natural resources. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, who was commanding the Fifth Fleet, emphasized surprise and air superiority. The invasion began under the cover of darkness on February the 9th of 1939, when Kondo's convoy entered Shanghai Bay on the northern shore of Hainan and anchored at midnight. Japanese troops swiftly disembarked, encountering minimal initial resistance from the very surprised Chinese defenders, and they secured a beachhead in the northern zone. At 3 a.m. on the 10th, the Formosa Mixed Brigade, operating in close cooperation with naval units, executed a surprise landing at the northeastern point of Tongmai Bay in northern Hainan. By 4:30, the right flank reached the main road leading to Fongyingqi, while the left flank reached a position just 2 kilometers south of Tanwei. By 7 a.m., the right flank unit had overcome light enemy resistance near Yuli and occupied Chongshan. And at that moment, there was approximately 1,000 elements of the enemy's 5th Infantry Brigade at Chongshan. They're actually militia. About half of these troops were completely destroyed. The remainder fled into the hills south of Tangmai in a state of disarray. At around 8:30 a.m. that same day, the left flank unit advanced to the vicinity of Shuchang and they seized Shunying's Heights. By about 12 o'clock, they occupied Haikou, the island's northern port city, and the administrative center. Army and naval forces coordinated to mop up remaining pockets of resistance in the northern areas, overwhelming the scattered Chinese security units through superior firepower and organization. No large-scale battles are recorded in primary accounts. Instead, the engagements were characterized by rapid advances and localized skirmishes, as Chinese forces lacking heavy artillery or air support could not mount a sustained defense. By the end of the day, Japanese control over the north was consolidating, with Haikou falling under their occupation. Also on the 10th, the brigade pushed forward to seize Qingang. Nanchang would be taken on the 22nd, followed by the Qinglang port on the 23rd. On the 11th, the operation expanded southward when land combat units amphibiously assaulted Sanya, the island's southern tip. This landing allowed them to quickly seize key positions, including the port of Yulin and the town of Yaxin. With these southern footholds secured, Japanese forces fanned out and they would subjugate the rest of the island, capturing inland areas and infrastructure with light, organized resistance. Meanwhile, the landing party of the South China Navy Expeditionary Force, which had joined the army to secure Haikou, began landing on the island's southern shore at dawn on February the 14th. They operated under the protection of naval and air units. By the same morning, the landing force had advanced to the Sairiyai, and by about 12 o'clock, they had captured Yunnan port. Chinese casualties were significant in the brief fighting. From January to May, reports indicate the 11th Security Regiment alone suffered 8 officers and 162 soldiers killed, 3 officers and 16 wounded, and about 5 officers and 68 missing, though figures from other units are quite unclear. Japanese losses were not publicly detailed, but they were apparently pretty light. When crisis pressed upon them, nationalist forces withdrew from the coastal Haikou, shepherding the last civilians towards the sheltering embrace of the Wuji mountain range and bands of the central spine of Hainan. From that high ground they sought to endure the storm, praying that the rugged hills might shield their families from the reach of the war. Yet the Li country's mountains did not deliver a sanctuary free of conflict. Later, in August of 1943, an uprising erupted amongst the Li. Wang Guoxing, a figure of local authority and stubborn resolve. His rebellion was swiftly crushed. In reprisal, the nationalists executed a seizure of vengeance that extended far beyond the moment of defeat, claiming 7,000 members of Wang Guoxing's kin in his village. This rather grim episode to the brutal calculus of war, where retaliation and fear inevitably etched the landscape towards family histories. And I'll remind the audience the primary source for this account is, of course, from the communists, so take it with a grain of salt. And of course, against this backdrop, the communists under Fang Baiju and the communities forged a vigorous guerrilla war against the occupiers. The struggle was not confined to partisan skirmishes alone. It unfolded as a broader contest of survival and resistance. The Japanese response was relentless and punitive, and it fell upon the communities in western Hainan with particular ferocity. Sanya and Guangzhou bore the brunt of the violence, as did many of the foreign laborers conscripted into the services by the occupying power. The toll of these reprisals was stark. Among hundreds of thousands of slave laborers pressed into the service, tens of thousands perished. Of the 100,000 laborers drawn from Hong Kong, only about 20,000 survived the war's trials, a haunting reminder of the human cost embedded in the occupation. Strategically, the island of Hainan took on a new course of purpose. Portions of the island were designated as a naval administrative district, with the Hainan Guard District headquarters established at Sanya, signaling its role as a forward air base and as an operational flank for the broader anti-Chiang Kai-shek efforts. In parallel, the island's rich iron and copper resources were exploited to sustain the war economy of the occupiers. The control of certain areas of Hainan provided a base of operations for incursions into Guangdong and French Indochina, while the air bases that dotted the island enabled long-range air raids that would threaten routes from French Indochina and Burma into the very heart of China. The island also assumed a grim dual character, a frontier fortress for the occupiers and as a ground for prolonged suffering of its inhabitants. Meanwhile, after Wuhan's collapse, the nationalist government's frontline strength remained formidable, even as attrition gnawed at its edges. By the winter, the front line had swelled to 261 divisions of infantry and cavalry, complemented by 50 independent mixed brigades. Yet the political and military fissures within the Kuomintang suggested fragility beneath the apparent depth of manpower. The most conspicuous rupture came with Wang Jingwei's defection, the vice president and the chairman of the National Political Council, who had fled to Hanoi by December the 18th of 1938, leading to a procession of more than 10 other KMT officials, including Chen Guangbo, Zhou Fuhai, Chu Mingqi, and Zheng Zhongming. In the rather harsh arithmetic of war, defections could not erase the country's common resolve to resist Japanese aggression, and the anti-Japanese National United Front still served as a powerful instrument, rallying the Chinese people to face the national crisis together. Amidst this political drama, Japan's strategy moved into a phase that sought to convert battlefield endurance into political consolidation. As early as January the 11th of 1938, Tokyo had convened an imperial conference and issued a framework for handling the China incident that would shape the theater for many years. The Outline of Army Operations Guidance and Continental Order No. 241 designated the occupied territories as strategic assets to be held with minimal expansion beyond essential needs. The instruction mapped an operational zone that compressed action to the corridors between Anqing, Xinjiang, Yuzhou, and Nanchang, while the broader line of occupation east of a line tracing West Sunit, Baotou, and the major river basins would be treated as pacified space. This was a doctrine of attrition, patience, and selective pressure, enough to hold ground, deny resources to the nationalists, and await a more opportune political rupture. Yet even as Japan sought political attrition, the war's tactical center of gravity drifted towards consolidation around Wuhan, and the pathways that fed Yangtze. In October of 1938, after reducing Wuhan to a fortress crescent of contested ground, the Japanese General Headquarters acknowledged the imperative to adapt to a protracted war. The new calculus prioritized political strategy alongside military operations. We should attach importance to the offensive of political strategy, cultivate and strengthen the new regime, and make the national government decline. It will be very effective. If the national government trembled under coercive pressure, it risked collapse. If not immediately, then gradually through a staged series of operations. In practice, this meant reinforcing a centralized center, while allowing peripheral fronts to be leveraged against Chongqing's grip on the war's moral economy. In the immediate post-Wuhan period, Japan divided its responsibilities and aimed at a standoff that would enable future operations. The 11th Army Group, stationed in the Wuhan theater, became the spearhead of field attacks on China's interior, occupying a strategic triangle that included Hunan, Jiangxi, and Guangxi. and protecting the rear of southwest China's line of defense. The central objective was not merely to seize territory, but to deny Chinese forces the capacity to maneuver along the critical rail and river corridors that fed the Nanjing-Zhejiang line, and of course the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Railway. Central to this plan was Wuhan's security and the ability to constrain Zhejiang's access to the Yangtze, preserving a corridor for air power and logistics. The pre-war arrangement in early 1939 was a tableau of layered defenses and multiple war zones, designated to anticipate a blunt Japanese maneuver. By February of 1939, the 9th War Zone under General Shi Yue stood in a tense standoff with the Japanese 11th Army along the Jiangxi and Hubei front south of the Yangtze. The 9th War Zone's order of battle, Liu Zhuoying's 19th Army Group defending the northern Nanchang front, Wang Lingji's 30th Army Group near Wuning, Fang Songfu's 8th and 73rd Armies along Honglu, Dang Ambo's 31st Army Group guarding southern Hubei and northern Hunan, and Liu Han's 1st Army Group in reserve near Changsha and Luoyang, were all carefully calibrated to absorb, delay, and disrupt any Shishui major Japanese thrust towards Nanchang, a city whose strategic significance stretched beyond its own bounds. In the spring of 1939, Nanchang was one city in southern China that Tokyo could not leave in Chinese hands. It was not simply another provincial capital, it was the beating heart of whatever remained of China's war effort south of the Yangtze, and the Japanese knew this. High above the Gan River, on the flat plains west of the Poyang Lake, lay three of the finest airfields China had ever built: Jingyunpu, Daxiaochang, and Xiangtang. Constructed only a few years earlier with Soviet engineers and American loans, they were long, hard-surfaced, and ringed with hangars and fuel dumps. Here the Chinese Air Force had pulled back after the fall of Wuhan, and here the Red Star fighters and bombers of Soviet volunteer groups still flew. From Nanchang's runways, a determined pilot could reach Japanese-held Wuhan in about 20 minutes, Guangzhou in less than an hour, and even strike the docks at Hong Kong if they wanted to push range. Every week, Japanese reconnaissance planes returned with photographs of fresh craters patched up, new aircraft parked wing to wing, and Soviet pilots sunning themselves beside their I-16s. As long as those fields remained Chinese, the Japanese could never claim the skies. The city was more than just airfields. It sat exactly where the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Railway met the line running north to Zhejiang and Yangtze, a knot that tied together the three provinces. Barges crowded Poyang's lake's western shore, unloading crates of Soviet ammunition and aviation fuel that would come up the river from the Indochina Railway. Warehouses along the tracks bulged with shells and rice. For the Japanese staff officers plotting in Wuhan and Guangzhou, Nanchang looked less like a city and more like a loaded spring. If Chiang Kai-shek ever found the strength for a counteroffensive to retake the middle Yangtze area, this would be the place from which it would emanate. And so, in the cold March of 1939, the Imperial General Headquarters marked Nanchang in red on every map and gave General Okamura the order he had been waiting for: take it, with whatever the cost may be. Capturing the city would do three things at once. It would blind the Chinese Air Force in the south by seizing or destroying the only bases from which it could still seriously operate. It would tear a hole in the last east-west railway line still feeding Free China. And it would shove the Nationalist armies another 200 kilometers farther into the interior, buying Japan precious time to digest its earlier conquests and tighten up the blockade. Above all, Nanchang was the final piece in a great aerial ring Japan was closing around southern China. Hainan had fallen in February, giving the Navy its southern airfields. Wuhan and Guangzhou already belonged to the Army. Once Nanchang was taken, Japanese aircraft would sit on a continuous arc of bases from the tropical beaches of the South China Sea to the banks of the Yangtze, and nothing, neither the Burma Road convoys nor the French railway from Hanoi, would move without their permission. Chiang Kai-shek's decision to strike first in the Nanchang region in March of 1939 reflected both the urgency and the desire to initiate an initiative before Japanese modernization of the battlefield could fully be consolidated. On March 8th, Chiang Kai-shek directed General Shi Yue to prepare a preemptive attack intended to seize the offensive by March 15th, focusing the 9th War Zone's efforts on preventing a river-crossing assault and pitting Japanese forces in place. The plan called for a sequence of coordinated actions, the 19th Army Group to hold the northern front of Nanchang, the Hunan-Hubei-Jiangxi Border Advance Army, that being the 8th and 73rd Armies, to strike the enemy's left flank from Wuning towards Duan and Wuchang, the 30th and 27th Army Groups to consolidate near Wuning, and the 1st Army Group to push towards Xiaoshui, Sandu, opening routes for subsequent operations. Yet even as Shiyue pressed for action, the weather of logistics and the training reminded observers that no victory could be taken for granted. By March the 10th, Shiyue warned Chiang Kai-shek that troops were not adequately trained, supplies were scarce, and preparations were insufficient, requesting a postponement till at least March 24th. Chiang Kai-shek's reply was resolute. The attack must commence no later than the 24th, for the aim was preemptive, and the desire to tether the enemy's forces before they could consolidate themselves. When the moment of decision arrived, the Chinese army began to tense, and the Japanese, no strangers to rapid shifts in tempo, moved to exploit any hesitation or fog of mobilization. The 9th War Zone's response crystallized into a defensive posture as the Japanese pressed forward, marking a transition from preemptive to standoff as both sides decided to test the limits of resilience. The Japanese plan for what would become known as Operation Ren aimed at severing the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Railway, breaking the enemy's line of communication, and isolating Nanchang. It reflected a calculated synthesis of air power, armored mobility, and a canalized ground offensive. February the 6th of 1939, the Central Chinese Expeditionary Army issued a set of precise directives: capture Nanchang to cut the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Railway, disrupt the southern reach of Anhui and Zhejiang provinces, seize Nanchang along the Nanchang-Shunyi axis to split the enemy's lines, and crush Chinese resistance south of that zone. Afterwards, they would secure rear lines immediately upon the city's fall, coordinate with naval air supports to threaten Chinese logistics and airfields beyond the rear lines. The plan anticipated contingencies by pre-positioning heavy artillery and tanks in formations that could strike with speed and depth, a tactical evolution from previous frontal assaults. Okamura, the commander of the 11th Army, undertook a comprehensive program of reconnaissance, refining the assault plan with renewed emphasis on speed and surprise. Aerial reconnaissance underlined the terrain, fortifications, and the disposition of Chinese forces, informing the selection of the Xiaoshui River crossing and the route of the main axis of attack. Okamura's decision to reorganize artillery and armor into concentrated tank groups, flanked by air support, and advanced by long-range maneuver, marked a departure from earlier methods of distributing heavy weapons along the infantry front. Sumata Dashiro, commanding the 6th Field Heavy Artillery Brigade, with more than 300 artillery pieces, while Hikyoshi Ishii directed a force of 135 tanks and armored vehicles. This blended arms approach promised quite a breakthrough that would outpace the Chinese defenders and open routes for the main force. By mid-February of 1939, Japanese preparations had taken on a high tempo. The 101st and 106th Divisions, along with attached artillery, assembled south of Duan, while tank contingents gathered north of Duan. The 6th Division began moving towards Luoxi and Wuning, and the Inuit detachment took aim at the waterways of Poyang Lake, while the 16th and 9th Divisions conducted feints around the Han River's left bank. The orchestration of these movements, feints, riverine actions, and armored flanking, was all designated to reduce the Chinese capacity to concentrate their forces around Nanchang and to force the defenders into less secure posture along the Nanchang-Zhejiang axis. Japan's southward strategy reframed the war, no longer a sprint to reduce Chinese forces in open fields, but a patient siege of lifelines, railways, and air bases. Hainan seizure, the control of Nanchang's airfields, and the disruption of the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Railway exemplified a shift from large-scale battles to coercive pressure that sought to cripple nationalist mobilization and erode Chongqing's capacity to sustain any resistance. For China, the spring of 1939 underscored resilience amidst mounting attrition. Chiang Kai-shek's insistence on offensive means to seize the initiative demonstrated strategic audacity, even as shortages and uneven training slowed tempo. The 9th War Zone's defense, bolstered by makeshift air power from Soviet and Allied landings, kept open critical corridors and delayed Japan's consolidation. The war's human cost, massive casualties, forced labor, and the Li uprisings on Hainan illuminated the brutality that fueled both sides' resolve. In retrospect, the period around Canton, Wuhan, and Nanchang crystallized a grim truth. The Sino-Japanese War was less a single crescendo of battles been a protracted contest of endurance, logistics, and political stamina. The early 1940s would widen these fault lines, but the groundwork was laid in 1939, seeing competition over supply routes, air control, and strategic railway nodes that would shape the war's pace, and ultimately its outcome. The conflict's memory lies not only in the clashes' flash, but in the stubborn persistence of a nation fighting to outlast a formidable adversary. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or Echoes of War, my podcast series found on major podcast platforms. And hey, if you're looking to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The Japanese invasion of Hainan and the preceding operations to stop logistical leaks into nationalist China showcased the complexity and the scale of the growing Second Sino-Japanese War. It would not merely be a war of territorial conquest. Japan would have to strangle the Colossus using every means necessary.